Voters sound off on political maps. States tackling election laws. Georgians voting today. States are crafting and enacting budgets. Plus, a major gun lawsuit gets dismissed. Welcome to the States, powered by the Center Square. It's Tuesday, June 16th, 2026, and I'm your host, Greg Bishop. Now, as many states rushed to redraw congressional maps ahead of the 2026 midterms, a new national poll finds half of American voters say that district lines should only be redrawn once a decade after the decennial U.S. Census. According to the Center Square Voters' Voice poll, 50% of voters, they say congressional lines should only be redrawn once every 10 years after the U.S. Census, except when required by a court. Joining us to discuss this further is the Center Square's Brett Rowland. Brett, thanks for taking time with us. A lot of data to pour through in the latest Voters' Voice poll, but we saw that half the country says, hey, only once a decade, unless by the courts. Where do the other 50% on this poll land?
That's a great question, Greg. Thanks so much for having me on. So about 33% say states should be allowed to redraw before the next census if they believe the maps are unfair or outdated. Another 17% were unsure. So you have this plurality of voters for a once in a decade standard, but about a third of voters are open to earlier redraws. The tension is really important here because about a quarter of all congressional seats have already been redrawn at mid-decade after President Trump's called on states to do so before the 2026 midterm election.
When it comes to the issue of redrawing maps, I mean, we've seen this litigated across the board. This year's been pretty busy. Even, the issue of how the maps are drawn, be it for political reasons or for racial reasons, as we've seen the courts tackle in the past, including this year. But there's nothing barring them, the states, from doing these mid-decade redrawing, is there?
No, that's exactly right. They're allowed to do this. It depends. Every state is different. Every state has their own election laws. So there's a lot of variation across the board. But you're right. There is absolutely nothing prohibiting them from doing it. It had sort of fallen out of favor for many years. And it was only done after the once a decade census. But this year, that's all changed. The last time we saw sort of a lot of redrawing was after the Civil War, when they were also looking for partisan advantage at that time. So it's something we haven't seen in a long time. It's definitely new. It's not unheard of, but it's something that hasn't been studied a ton.
Yeah, and it's interesting to kind of see, those of us like you and I who've been in the news business, watching how this works every 10 years. We kind of know about this, but the general public might not so much understand it. They're getting a lesson this year in it for sure. But back to this particular poll question, 50% say only once every decade after the census. You see that other breakdown. What about the breakdown across political lines, right? I mean, because the Voters' Voice poll does give you more than just the who's in favor, who's not. They give you Republican outcome, Democrat outcome, independent outcome. What does that look like?
So there's some differences here, but there's more bipartisanship than you might imagine here. But so the Republicans are split more than you might expect. 52% say they favor waiting for the census, but 40% say states should be allowed to redraw earlier. So that's essentially even. Democrats were more firmly opposed. You had 57% favor the once a decade standard, and then about 28% earlier redraws. When it gets to independents, that's where it gets a little bit more interesting. So you got 46% saying they prefer waiting, 23% say they support earlier draws, and 31% not sure. That's the highest not sure out of any of the groups we've looked at. So this isn't totally a partisan issue. A majority of Republicans still prefer waiting for the census, even as the Republican states are sort of leading this charge. Although Democrats, as we've seen, have certainly responded in kind in states where they have power.
Yeah, this issue of not sure popping up in these polls is kind of fascinating. But the poll comes as states across the country rushing to redraw those maps, as we talked about. We could go through the entire list of California, Florida, Missouri, North Carolina, Tennessee, and even more. But you've talked with some academics about all of this. What are they telling you, just in general, about the entire issue of drawing maps?
So I did. I got some great experts to weigh in on this. The first on Benjamin Schneer from Harvard Kennedy School. He said voter opposition to this is real, and that survey research has found that Americans view gerrymandering on the same footing as political corruption. They do not like this. But he said that poll opposition alone is not going to do anything to stop politicians from doing this. He said it would take something like a sustained focus and a more compelling narrative to even get close to moving the needle on this. I also talked with Kyle Kondik from the UVA Center for Politics. He said also that he doubts there are real consequences for states that have already gerrymandered. He said Democratic states will likely go to voters in 2027 to unwind the redistricting commissions and rules. And then he said that winning those battles might not be easy. Walter Olson from the Cato Institute, he said that not only is mid-cycle redistricting expensive, think about printing ballots and that kind of things. We weren't able to get a hard cost on this, but we know that the costs are out there. They're just not all in one place. He also said that the initial partisan advantages tend to disappear once the opposing power responds in kind. So you sort of see these go back and forth. And then
and you have to think too about the confusion to the voters, right? They're in one district one year, and then the next time they go, they find out, well, wait a second, I thought my representative was this person. Now it's somebody else entirely different.
Right, and that was a point that Olson really spoke about. He said that the voters don't like this, and they would rather not this happen. But the other thing is that we did see that voters really like those independent commissions. But I talked with Jason Torchinsky, who's an election law attorney. He said that those also have their drawbacks. He said redistricting is essentially complex. Public opinion shifts constantly, and that independent commissions can have some real drawbacks.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, because regardless if it's mid-decade or not, it has to be done after each decennial census. And another question on this that was asked to the Voters' Voice poll respondents dealt with whether or not you have an independent redistricting commission, or if the state legislators who are elected are drawing these things, or if it's going to have to be the courts, maybe. What did we find from that poll data, from that separate question?
So this is real interesting. About 41% trust independent commissions to draw fair congressional lines. 16% said they trust state legislatures. Another 15% said they trust courts. And here's this number: 27% said they're not sure. But
again, Brett, I mean, this not sure person keeps popping up in these polls. What do you think that's an indication of?
I think the complexity is at least part of it. Now, voters are smart. They get what's going on, especially when it comes to partisan stuff. I don't think they need to be told what to do, but these are very complex issue, and how your state or maybe even your local election commission handles these things could be different from what's happening elsewhere. So there's a lot of levels of government here involved in the election process, and a lot going on. So I think that's where some of the uncertainty is. But the big picture is that there's a more than 2-to-1 margin for commissions over having the state legislatures draw the maps themselves. And that's pretty bipartisan.
There's a lot of different ways to do that. As you said, some of your academic sources highlighting, hey, there might be some positive things, but there could also be some drawbacks or unforeseen consequences. Brett, greatly appreciate your time. Be sure to get the newsletter with the latest Voters' Voice poll information by signing up for free today at thecentersquare.com. We'll be right back. President Donald Trump has once again complicated Republican leadership plans, demanding Monday that lawmakers in Congress attach voter ID legislation to the spy powers reauthorization bill. Welcome back to the States. In Center Square's Therese Boudreau reporting that U.S. House lawmakers failed to pass even a short-term extension of the Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, known as FISA, before they recessed Friday. Hours before, the president offered a belated olive branch to Democrats. And then days later, in a Truth Social post, Trump announcing that he would be, quote, against FISA if it doesn't come with the Save America Act full version firmly attached to it. Now, what is the Save America Act? It would mandate that Americans display a valid ID to vote in federal elections. It would require people to present proof of citizenship when registering to vote, and it would necessitate in-person voter registration for federal elections. It also directs all states to remove all non-citizens from their voter rolls. Now, under the legislation pending in Congress, people would not be able to register to vote with only their driver's license, since non-citizens in some states can obtain those. They would instead need to present documents proving U.S. citizenship, such as a birth certificate or a U.S. passport, when they go to register to vote. Now, Democrats argue that the in-person registration and proof of citizenship requirements would unduly burden Americans who are disabled, live in remote areas, or don't have access to the correct documentation. Now, in California, local governments, they're being challenged in the courts for letting non-citizens vote in some elections. In a recent San Francisco County program, County Attorney David Chu was asked about the status of lawsuits challenging laws that do allow non-citizens to vote in some elections.
From 1776 for 150 years till after World War I, immigrants were allowed to vote in most states in our country on the theory that we want to assimilate immigrants in American democratic values and institutions. And it wasn't until an anti-immigrant backlash in World War I that sort of ended. But in recent years, cities across America have allowed this to happen. In fact, at this moment, I believe there are over a dozen cities that have voted to allow non-citizens to vote in a number of contexts. Now, this is particularly important in our schools, just given how challenged our schools are, and given that we know that when we engage more parents in our school system, regardless of their citizenship, it helps to lift up our schools for all parents. And so in 2016, the voters of San Francisco passed a ballot measure that allowed this to happen. Unfortunately, earlier this year, there were conservative organizations that came to San Francisco to bring a lawsuit to try to overturn this. And I should also mention, it is obviously the perspective of our office and our city that this is constitutional. Nothing in the Constitution prohibits non-citizens from voting. And in fact, there's an explicit provision in the Constitution that allows chartered cities like San Francisco, when it comes to school board elections, to be able to dictate the time and manner of those elections.
Now, how that plays out in the courts, observers still have yet to see. But also in California, in the state Senate, Republican State Senator Kelly Ciardo, he had this to say about the state's spending priorities and how it impacts election law.
In the budget, you will find a lot of examples of stuff that we should not be spending money on in place of other things. One of those is $5 million that we're giving to the students of UCLA so they can do a project which is going around the United States suing other governments over their election stuff, over voter integrity or whatever it is. If they want to do that, that's great. Their parents can administer, they can donate money to a fund for that. But in place of that, we have, to my colleague's comment earlier about our senior population, we have a senior center down in Riverside. That is in dire need of upgrading their facility. It's fallen down around them. They can't help all the seniors that they're supposed to be helping. They need $3 million, but instead we're going to spend $5 million to students at UCLA so they can run around suing people in the United States. That's absurd. That is an absurd waste of our money.
Now, it looks a little different in Arizona as legislators there looking to establish better checks of voter rolls, or at least asking voters to make that decision. Arizona Republican State Representative Rachel Keschel, she laid out what the issue is all about.
So I want to just point out what my colleague in District 16 said, that election integrity is extremely important to constituents on both sides of the aisle. 2/3 of Americans don't trust that our elections are free and fair. That is Democrats, Republicans, and independents. And this bill doesn't do anything to mail-in ballots, which over 80% of Arizonans love. What this bill does is things that we are assured in our Constitution anyway. We should be citizens in order to vote in our elections. We should have valid ID in order to vote in our elections. Our vote is sacred. Each and every one of our votes is sacred. It is how we pick our elected officials that we want to guide us at both state, federal, and local levels. The issue of citizenship and voter ID is something that over 90% of Americans, Arizona is high on the scale, believe that we should have regarding voting.
Now, the point being made there is it's not something to change Arizona law, but simply ask voters their thoughts on voter ID and other election integrity initiatives. But not everybody on board with asking voters that. Arizona Democratic State Representative Stacey Travers, she criticized the measure on the Arizona House floor.
I don't think necessarily the issue is whether anybody wants free and fair and secure and timely elections, because I don't know that there's anybody out there who wouldn't want that. I think the concerns with this legislation, more importantly, are that even after 2.5 years, there's still a lot of concerns that haven't been addressed properly. I can tell you that 10 recorders still oppose it, 13 election directors still oppose it. This is going to cost over $22 million. Some of my concerns are when we talk about early identification, how will a voter be providing ID, quote unquote, before casting an early ballot, which is the dominant way Arizona voters choose to cast a ballot? We have been asking this question many times since the bill was introduced and still have not received an answer.
Now, another election procedure issue states are grappling with is, can states count federal election ballots after Election Day? The U.S. Supreme Court case, Watson versus RNC, that was heard by the U.S. Supreme Court in March, that mail-in ballots counting case still pending. It could come as early as Thursday with a decision. That's the court's next decision day. But the courts move at their own pace, and observers have no way of knowing for sure if that case will be decided before the election in November. We'll keep our eyes out for that with the states. We'll be right back. Everyone knows Georgia is special, but the Peach State is really special today because there's an election and there's also an upcoming special session. Welcome back to the States. Joining us to discuss the latest out of Georgia is the Center Square Associate Editor Kim Jarrett. Kim, thanks for taking time with us. A lot to discuss about the election today. You're going to have a late night. Let's start with that. What's at stake in this runoff election?
Well, Greg, thanks for having me. There's a lot at stake. We're going to decide who, well, I'm not in Georgia anymore, but I'm a Georgia native. They're going to decide who is the gubernatorial candidate for governor that's going to go against Keisha Lance Bottoms, who beat a crowded field of Democrats rather in her runoff, and didn't even in her election, she didn't have to have a runoff. But we have Burt Jones, who was the lieutenant governor, and Rick Jackson, who's a businessman, and they have both been competing for endorsements from Governor Kemp and from Governor Trump. Well, Trump gave his endorsement to Burt Jones before Rick Jackson entered the race in February. And Governor Kemp, surprise on Sunday, shocked a lot of people by endorsing Burt Jones. They've had a history of, being a little bit at odds over some issues in the past. So people were really surprised. And then Donald Trump Jr., on Monday, sent out a tweet saying, well, Rick Jackson's a good guy. He set an example of some things that Rick Jackson had done in the past. And then quickly said in a comment under his social media post, well, this is not an endorsement, but MAGA is going to win whether our Jones or Jackson is elected on Tuesday. So that just was crazy. We also have a U.S. Senate race. Mike Collins, who is a U.S. representative, he's going against Derek Dooley, former head football coach of Tennessee and son of Vince Dooley, who was the athletic director and head football coach at the University of Georgia for a very long time. Trump introduced Collins on Saturday, very last minute, wasn't expected. Kemp has endorsed Dooley. The latest poll from Insider Advantage shows that these races are razor thin close for 48 to 49% in both cases. So it's going to be a long night. I don't even know. I can't even predict if we're going to have any results by in the morning. I don't know.
Well, it's something that every election night, team from the center square is watching the numbers come in and getting out the latest. And this is, like you said, a lot at stake here. While Democrats might be sitting this one out for this runoff election, when it comes to who's going to be the Republican candidate for governor, who's going to be the U.S. Senate candidate, these are very important questions all across the country. Talk a little bit more, though, if you can, about what some of the key differences outside of endorsements or pseudo endorsements, like Trump Jr.'s statement, I guess you could call it. What are some of the key differences that these two Republicans looking to become governor are really, really showing to voters?
So Jackson is a self-made businessman. He grew up in foster care. He uses that as part of his story on the campaign trail. He has pretty much self-funded his campaign, taken no donations. Governor Jones, Lieutenant Governor Jones, of course, he's taken some donations. He's been lieutenant governor for the past 4 years. Before that, he was a member of the state senate. He has accused Jackson of trying to buy the election. There's been a lot of campaign ads that have been competing. If you live in Georgia or even on the outskirts of Georgia, as I do, you see them. Rick Jackson has been saying, okay, he's been throwing all kinds of shade at Burt Jones for corruption, saying, oh, well, he's got business interests he's trying to fulfill by becoming governor. Jackson is kind of like saying, I don't owe anybody anything. Jones is saying, no, he's trying to buy us. I have the experience. I have the backing. He has the Trump endorsement. Now he has the Kemp endorsement. There's been some lawsuits back and forth. Jones is able, under state law, to use what's called a leadership committee to fund his campaign. Jackson sued him over that. Jones has sued Jackson over some campaign ads he said that weren't unfair. It's been very nasty. I think the interesting thing about this is Keisha Lance Bottoms, who's just waiting to challenge whoever in November. She's saying, hey, y'all are already doing the work for me by attacking each other. I don't even have to worry about creating any ads. Y'all made so many accusations against each other. I have all the ammunition I need in November.
Have either of these Republican candidates indicated that they'd back whoever wins, or are we still in that stage, even though it is election day today, that no, they're the ones that are going to win?
They've not indicated they're going to back each other. It's been, I hate to use the word nasty, but it's kind of like how it's been. They have really been, Jackson did not show up for the last debate sponsored by the Atlanta Press Club. So Jones had the stage to himself. At the previous debate during the primary, they went after each other's throats, and the other candidates on the stage seemed to go after Jones. Chris Carr, the attorney general, who was in the race, he was telling Jones, I would investigate you if I wasn't in this gubernatorial race right now. And he went ahead and backed Jackson. Brad Raffensperger, who is the Secretary of State, he's got his hands full right now. He hasn't endorsed anyone. So it's just been interesting to watch the going back and forth, because even in the first debate, you had a bunch of people on stage, but all the attention was focused on Jackson and Jones.
Well, and voters are going to make that decision tonight with the polls closing later on this evening. Be sure to get the latest at thecentersquare.com. Something else, though, Kim, that's happening, making Georgia very special, is a special election. And there seems to be a lot on the plate here for legislators. Where do we begin?
Well, let's start with why they called this special session in the first place. So Georgia elections, there's been a lot of controversy since 2020. So in 2024, the Georgia legislature passed a bill and said, okay, you cannot use QR codes to count ballots. Think of a QR code kind of like that little, thing you see on your groceries that you scan.
Like a barcode.
Right,
yeah.
barcode. That's the word I'm looking for. Thank you. So they were like, okay, we're going to ban these. Well, they didn't fund it. Neither the Secretary of the State or the legislature gave election officials any guidance as to, well, what do we do now that we cannot use these QR codes? So here we are. We have a special election on July 28th to fill the seat of the late David Scott. He passed away in office. He was a U.S. representative. And the law is set to take effect July 1st. So Governor Kemp said, okay, we're going to have to call a special session and fix all of this right now. So that was the first reason. They also, Kemp had said early on, and I loved your segment with Brett about redistricting. Kemp said early on that he wasn't going to try to redraw district lines before the November midterms, but he has said that lawmakers can redraw the district lines for 2028 in this special session. So they're going to take that on. Then they added a third thing at the last minute.
I feel like my buffet plate is getting a little full at this moment. I've already got two major issues, and now we've got a couple others that are going to be impacting taxpayers.
Well, one of the fuel tax one is already impacted taxpayers. So Governor Kemp and the legislature agreed earlier this year where we're going to do a 2-month fuel tax moratorium. So they cut the fuel tax for 2 months. Well, Memorial Day was coming up, and that fuel tax was set to expire on May 20th. Governor Kemp called it a state of emergency and extended it for 2 weeks. Basically, this legislature is just going to go in there and they're going to rubber stamp it. So that's the fourth issue. Number 3 is a bit more complicated, but could have a big impact on some taxpayers. So you may recall that Georgia was trying to reduce the property taxes, do whatever they could about property taxes during the legislative session. The only thing they were able to pass is a 3% or a rate. They basically were freezing the assessments, not the taxes, the assessments on your property at the rate of inflation. So that's all they passed. But they did say in this bill that cities and counties can pass a special sales tax, and that could be used to offset property taxes. They call it an LHOST. But what they didn't do is, for cities and counties to get this sales tax in place, they have to have a local referendum. That has to be approved by the legislature, and they went out of session. So Kemp added this to the special session agenda. So I think I've seen 1 or 2 communities who are saying we're going to ask the legislature to approve a referendum so we can go before our voters in November and not have to wait until next year when the legislature returns in January. So that was something that Kemp added at the last minute, well, a couple of weeks ago. So there's 4 things they are going to be talking about, and it's going to be very, very busy.
There's going to be a lot going on there, no question. When does special session start?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow? So you've got an election tonight you're staying up for, and then you're going to have to jump into these 4 very complex issues. Well, at least one of them, the gas tax moratorium, that might be rubber stamped, but still a lot of reasons why people need to stay up to date with what's going on in Georgia with Kim and her team. Keeping an eye on that. Greatly appreciate you taking the time here, and get the newsletter for the latest on the runoff election tonight, and also what's going to be happening with special session by getting the newsletter at thecentersquare.com. We'll be right back. Big story out of California is making national headlines, but taxpayers there may want to know what's happening at the California State House. Welcome back to the States. I'm Greg Bishop. California Governor Gavin Newsom has alleged that President Donald Trump and the U.S. Department of Justice are investigating him and his wife without cause. Now, the news came from a Newsom social media post where he alleged the investigation was politically motivated ahead of the 2028 presidential run. Newsom, who's termed out as governor of California, said that he's considering a bid for the White House. But taxpayers in California may want to take note of the budget that's making its way through the California legislature. The Center Square California reporter Madeline Shannon reporting the Senate Budget Committee Monday approved the latest version of California's spending plan, which greenlights $355.9 billion in spending. Of that, $253 billion is in the state's general fund, according to State Senator John Laird out of Santa Cruz, a Democrat and the chair of the Senate Budget Committee. Approximately $36.5 billion is reserve funding, which will allow the state to responsibly budget for years ahead, Laird said at the onset of that meeting in Sacramento.
Our state continues to face some hard choices in this budget. And in making these hard decisions, the legislatures come together and remain faithful to the framework put forth by the Senate, which was that we were committed to responsible budgeting. We maintain the vital programs California depends on. It takes a balanced approach, making targeted reductions and adopting $5 billion in new revenues.
Now, the budget approved Monday delays Medi-Cal cuts to July 1st, 2027, which Governor Gavin Newsom proposed. Now, the cuts would affect California residents with unsatisfactory immigration status or those who are illegal immigrants or immigrants who sought asylum in California. It also allocates up to $190 million in forgivable loans to distressed hospitals, and an additional $250 million for public hospitals, among other items, throughout the spending plan. Now, the taxpayer-funded budget also preserves the current number of taxpayer-funded slots for childcare and allocates another funding to increase the number of spots by 22,770 in the coming year. Now, the California budget also provides additional funds for affordable housing and homelessness housing assistance. Republican lawmakers on the committee said that they felt the budget was incomplete. They noted the budget is built on the assumption that taxes would actually go up to fuel the state's high level of spending in the state budget. Here's California Republican State Senator Roger Niello.
I'll repeat, as I have my entire time since I've been back in the legislature, following the lead of the advice of the ledge analyst, that the only way out of our structural deficit, which still exists, is to do the hard analysis of the efficacy and realistic sustainability of select spending programs. That hasn't been done. I don't see signs that on a comprehensive basis, as I've suggested, that it will be done. But I know the taxpayers of our state would very much appreciate that.
Now, the latest version of the budget cleared the Senate Budget Committee weeks after the legislative analyst's office projected a nearly $17 billion deficit, even with the governor's attempt to present a balanced budget for his last year in office. Now, Newsom's May budget proposal advanced solutions to close the budget gap, including limiting business credit use, taxing software, and taxing managed care operations. Now, according to a May 19th story at the Center Square, the Golden State still remains in a multi-year budget deficit despite higher than expected revenues, mostly due to planned spending exceeding revenue growth. California State Legislative Analysts Gabriel Pettick, he shared some thoughts to the committee yesterday in Sacramento.
resources. So in total, there's about $8 billion in additional resources under the legislative agreement relative to the May revision. And with that, the legislative package makes some different spending and budget choices. And so as a result of that, even with the higher level of resources, that at the end of the day, the budget condition is broadly very similar to the budget condition that we saw in the May revision.
Now, after its passage by the Senate Budget Committee, the bill advanced to the Assembly Budget Committee. And while California continues to advance their budget priorities, taxpayers in Pennsylvania, they're still looking to get details on how the state plans to spend their money in the coming budget. Pennsylvania counties last year lost millions of dollars, and domestic violence programs in the state laid off workers, some of whom were never returned to their jobs, as a result of state leaders missing that budget deadline by 135 days. Now, this year, as the team from the Center Square is reporting, the June 30th deadline for that new budget is just 2 weeks away. Few specifics have been mentioned publicly about any kind of closed-door negotiations between Republicans and Democrats in that divided assembly. Those who got burned last year said that they hope the fact that many lawmakers and the governor are up for re-election in 2026 will grease the skids, so to speak, toward an agreement. Now, lawmakers and the administration of Democrat Governor Josh Shapiro, they blew through the June 30th deadline last year, even though there were optimistic statements made near the end of June. And that $50.1 billion budget bill, it wasn't signed until November 12th. And in the meantime, billions of dollars in payments to school districts and counties across the state were withheld, and employees in various fields were furloughed. Now, one of the biggest challenges budget negotiators face in Pennsylvania is the state's level of annual spending, roughly $5 billion, than what it brings in from the taxpayers. And in Illinois, Governor J.B. Pritzker signing the largest state budget in Illinois history this morning in Chicago. Here's the governor.
Thank you all for joining us for the signing of Illinois' 8th consecutive balanced budget. In a year marked by economic uncertainty, rising costs, and unprecedented fiscal challenges created by Donald Trump and the MAGA Congress, Illinois has once again demonstrated that responsible governing and balanced budgets go hand in hand with making life more affordable for working families and investing in the future. This budget lowers costs for everyday Illinoisans. It protects our state's fiscal health, and it continues the economic progress we have worked so hard to build over the last 7.5 years.
Now, critics say Illinois' budget continues to spend on growing the government with increased fees and taxes without providing real relief to taxpayers paying the highest property taxes in the nation. Illinois' $55 billion budget year begins July 1st. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to stay up to date with the latest. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the States. Now it's time for America's Talking, with headlines from across the country that you can find in the description below or in your inbox with the Center Square newsletter, free at thecentersquare.com. Legal claims against gun manufacturers can go forward, implementing a 2021 New York firearms law signed by then Governor Andrew Cuomo. Second Amendment groups had challenged that law. All the way up to the judiciary, with Monday, the Center Square contributor Chris Wade reporting the U.S. Supreme Court declining to hear the litigation filed by gun makers, saying that state law was preempted by the federal 2005 Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, known as PLACA, which blocks litigation that could negatively impact the firearms industry. Now, the National Shooting Sports Foundation, a trade association representing gun manufacturers, said it was disappointed by the panel's ruling and disagrees with the court's reasoning to uphold New York's law. Now, gun manufacturers, including Smith & Wesson, Ruger, and Sig Sauer, had signed on to Supreme Court appeals. They say New York's law unconstitutionally conflicted with federal law. The appeal was also backed by the National Rifle Association, 24 Republican state attorneys general, and several dozen Republican lawmakers who filed legal briefs in the case. Democratic Governor Kathy Hochul praised the high court's ruling, calling it a massive victory for gun control efforts in a state with some of the strictest firearm requirements in the nation. Last month, Hochul signed a budget that makes New York the latest state to restrict so-called ghost guns, a colloquial term that means firearms that can be assembled using parts manufactured on 3D printers. And that drew legal threats with more possible litigation from Second Amendment groups. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis announcing Friday the state is implementing new safeguards to prevent Medicaid fraud. The Center Square contributor Marilee Gasser reports the Medicaid Integrity Initiative includes stronger oversight with provider screenings, enrollment moratoriums, and tools to identify potentially fraudulent billing. As part of the initiative, the Florida Agency for Healthcare Administration is launching a program to improve provider screening and detect fraud schemes like stolen identities and hidden ownership structures. Enrollment moratoriums will be imposed on some high-risk provider categories like durable medical equipment suppliers and adult care providers. Additionally, all Florida Medicaid providers will be required to revalidate their credentials. Those who don't comply will be removed from the program. The agency is also deploying new tools to help identify fraudulent billing practices and work with law enforcement. The Obama Presidential Center scheduled to open in Chicago Thursday, but financial questions are looming over the facility and the people who live nearby. The Center Square, Illinois reporter Jim Talamonte reports groundbreaking for the development on the city's south side was held in 2021, but the project was delayed several times. Construction cost estimates rose from around $350 million to at least $830 million. Emily Tallon, professor of urbanism at the University of Chicago, which is nearby, said that you can see the changes in the neighborhood. She said long-term residents have been crying out about what the new investment's doing to their neighborhood, like people being displaced or concerns over gentrification or other issues. Tallon said government officials must step up to prevent negative impacts. But Cook County Board President Tony Preckwinkle took a preview of the Obama Center Inn and called it a, quote, wonderful place. Preckwinkle expressed hope that visitors to the nearby Griffin Museum of Science and Industry would also visit the Presidential Center. In addition to displacing residents, it's complicated things through traffic congestion and higher property tax bills. Louisiana has enacted a pair of new laws requiring additional disclosures on foods produced through emerging technologies as state lawmakers push for greater transparency in how products are made and earmarked to consumers. That marketing happening in the Center Square, Louisiana editor Misty Castile reporting Governor Jeff Landry signing House Bill 783 earlier this month. The law requires products made with dairy proteins produced through microbial fermentation that they carry a disclosure stating that that process was used. There's another measure that Landry also signed that does something similar. House Bill 717, signed into law, requires cell-cultured food products sold in Louisiana to include a clear and conspicuous disclosure identifying that the product was cell-cultured. That law takes effect August 1st. And that's just some of what America is talking about. You can get the latest of these headlines and others at thecentersquare.com. From my studios in Central Illinois, I'm Greg Bishop. And join us back here tomorrow for more stories impacting you, the taxpayer, from around the country, only with the states, powered by the Center Square.